Hello, I'm Maddy Harland. Welcome to The Word. I had this week a conversation with Manda Scott and Professor Rupert Read about transformative adaptation and throughtopias and other subjects. And I wanted to introduce you to Rupert and Manda before the conversation starts. So Rupert Read is the co-director of the Climate Majority Project, and he's an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He's the author of several books, and he developed the concept of transformative adaptation, which you will hear more about in a minute. He also invented the term throughopia, which is an act of imagining the actual mechanics of how we transition from this broken, collapsing world into one that's in a process of transformation and healing on all levels. Manda Scott, formerly a veterinary surgeon, is now an award-winning novelist, podcaster and regenerative smallholder. She is the co-creator of the Throughtopian Masterclass, and she's committed to laying the foundations to a future that we would be proud to leave behind. Her podcast is called Accidental Gods, and you'll find it at accidentalgods.life. I highly recommend it. So in this conversation, we speak about transformative adaptation, throughtopias, connection instead of consumption, and other solutions to this unfolding meta-crisis. This is a heartwarming, inspiring, and insightful conversation from these two wonderful people, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to share this with you at the Permaculture Magazine YouTube channel. Please do press the like button, and please do subscribe if you like this conversation. It will help us to provide you with many more. Thank you very much for watching, and do enjoy. So Rupert, can we start at the very beginning and you briefly explain what transformative adaptation is and where did it come from indeed as an idea?
Well, let me take a step back and first let's get clear on what climate adaptation in general is. So climate adaptation means responding to climate impacts. So this is different from what's called decarbonisation or mitigation, which is reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere so that those impacts will over time gradually be reduced or at least stabilised. But climate adaptation says, yes, but we actually also have to deal with the impacts that are here and the ones that are coming. And the point of our book is that firstly, this hasn't been talked about and done very much yet. But secondly, when it has been talked about and done, it's mostly been done in a shallow way, in a defensive way. People have been like, oh, right, so we've got worse flooding incidents, so we better raise our hard flood defenses some. And our fundamental point in a way is that's not a good enough response. You need to have a response which is more forward-looking, which is, well, transformative. What transformative adaptation is trying to respond to climate impacts in a way that is actually genuinely creative and forward-looking, not merely trying to perpetuate the existing society that we've got within, for example, higher flood barriers, but thinking much more creatively about how do we reduce the flooding that is occurring in the first place by, say, upland water management or restoring peatlands and wetlands. And transformative adaptation says also, and we need to do these kinds of things in a way that is compatible with decarbonisation and mitigation at minimum, right? So, for instance, again, if you recreate peatlands, you can simultaneously reduce the amount of water pressure on an area and sequester carbon. That's the kind of creative thinking that we need, looking for win-wins. And in fact, win-win-wins, because it's also about changing the kind of society we have so that it actually is potentially a society that flourishes. So a society that is more local, a society which has stronger communities where we grow more of our own food, store more of our own water, the kind of agenda of localization and so forth that many of us have been arguing for a long time anyway, including, of course, in permaculture. And so that's what transformative adaptation is. It's doing climate adaptation and taking it seriously in a way that at the same time mitigates and at the same time tries to create the kind of society that we actually want in the future.
So it's a kind of holy grail, really, in the sense that you get these three dimensions, and one is strategic as an intervention, but the others actually create much better outcomes in the first place. So, you know, I would add something like, if you add the dimension of rewilding, instead of just rewilding for species diversity, we would be rewilding for carbon sequestration as well, and flood mitigation.
And rewilding for a better life for human beings, for a wilder, more nature-friendly, if you will, life for human beings. Absolutely. And this, of course, is why this whole kind of agenda of transformative adaptation is so exciting and seems to be an idea whose time may have come. Because who doesn't want to put all these things together? And yet it hasn't been done yet at all. It hasn't even been taken seriously yet. You ask, where does the idea come from? So the idea of transformative adaptation has got some roots in the academic world and in UN processes. The think tank I used to run, Greenhouse, did a book basically on it in 2019 called Facing Up to Climate Reality. But that book was only quite indirectly on transformative adaptation. What's different about this book is that we're bringing together these ideas in a way that is really focused and explicit. And we hope very, very closely attuned to this very difficult and yet full of opportunity moment that we're in.
So turning to you, Manda, can you tell me a little bit about, can you put transformative adaptation into a context? So how does it contribute to this process of systemic change that we so desperately need? How does it work as a lever to sort of encourage that process to tip into it?
That depends on how we go about it, I think. Donella Meadows' levers of change are really clear, that policy change is at the bottom and paradigm shift is at the top. And in my mind, if we are to transform and adapt in the way that we need to, it needs to arise out of a paradigm shift. And here, when we end up in one of the multipolar traps where not changing is not in anybody's interest, but nobody wants to be the person who changes first. And so I think what we're providing is something of a template of what change might look like, because it seems to me really clear that we are in the dying days of the old system. However, there are a lot of people clinging on with their fingernails, maintaining old narratives, maintaining business as usual narratives when you only have to experience anybody's life and business as usual is dying. So nobody is going to change unless we help them to understand what else might be possible. Give them ideas of how a different world might look and feel, and that it's not everybody living in a cave, toasting each other over piles of burning tires, which tends to be the narrative that we're given. It's either business as usual or it's some kind of dystopic disaster. And so for me, the concept of transformation is integral to where we need to go. What are we transforming into? Who are we as human beings? I loved James Lovelock's last and greatest book, Novacene. So he was the person who evolved the Gaia hypothesis. And the first half of that book really is him suggesting that the Earth is a living organism, his Gaia hypothesis, that it stored as much carbon as it possibly could over a very, very, very long period of time, and then let it all go in a burst in an effort to transform its own consciousness. And there's a lot of holes in that, and we could spend the rest of this time picking them out, and let's not bother. But what if we are the planetary consciousness, doing our very best, all 8 billion of us, to evolve into something different, to transform, in order to adapt to the climatic disasters and the ecosystem disasters and the whole multi-system disaster that we're facing? So, so I see the book and the idea as offering a template and doorways out of the system that we've got into a whole new system. But that system will have to be predicated on a different value set than the ones that are locked into our trauma culture. So for me, the values are integral, but you can't make people change their values. You can only live in a world where the values are changing, and then people's values will shift with them. So we need that advanced guard, in a way, to be living the value shift in order that the ripples can spread outwards until we've got a critical mass that will take us over a tipping point.
And what does that look like? Do you have a shape to it, either of you?
Rupert was taking notes, so let's go to Rupert.
Well, what I was actually about to say was that I love Manda's description of you've got business as usual, which is taking us on the pathway towards a dystopic, catastrophic future. And then you've got the possibility of another world, right? And that, of course, is the subtitle that in the end, after a lot of discussion among ourselves, we settled on for the book. Another world is still just possible. And I think that gets it pretty much exactly right. As I sometimes put it now, there is a small and rapidly closing window for us to avoid civilizational collapse and for us to instead transform in the kind of way that is imagined and envisaged in this book. And it would be very tragic, obviously, if we were not to seize that opportunity and find a way of passing through that window. And through is, of course, the operative word, as in the idea that I developed of through-topia as an alternative to dystopia, which is obviously where we don't want to go, and utopias, which are tragically now closed off to us. Through-topia is how do we get through, how do we transform in the best way possible in the light of being based fairly and squarely in the circumstances that we're actually based in. And that is the part of the book, actually, that Manda contributes the most to and is directly relevant to your question, Maddy. But I should say that the book does not attempt to give a sort of full description of what this is actually going to look like. It's a short book, which we hope will attract a lot of people. And it's a book which is schematic, partly because we think that it isn't really credible to describe a sort of wonderful outcome, which is kind of predetermined. What's going to be wonderful is how we respond creatively and beautifully to enormous difficulties and challenges, which are going to come to us in the next generation or two. You know, that really is the through-topian vision. That really is the transformative adaptation vision, rolling with the punches of the very difficult times that are coming to turn those times into something splendid as we get through what is coming, if we can, in the very best way possible. But I think, Manda, you should elaborate a bit on that, because as I say, you actually spend the most time in the book addressing this part of the question directly.
Thank you. Yes. So I think one of the key things that is useful to get across is that we are looking for emergence into a new system. And by definition, a new system is not predictable from the old system. If we could predict it, it wouldn't be a new system. It would just be an iteration of the old system. However,
exactly.
We can take ourselves to the emergent edge of what Indy Johar calls interbecoming, where emergence into a flourishing system is more likely than collapse into chaos and extinction. And I think we can see how that looks fairly clearly. It needs to be predicated on different values. We said that already. So if we were to posit that the values of business as usual are scarcity, separation, and powerlessness, it needs to be predicated on connection, sufficiency, and agency. And what does that feel like? What does it feel like if somebody, anyone, everyone, were to wake up in the morning and feel safe, feel confident, feel that we don't quite know what the world is bringing because nothing is predictable, but not being able to predict doesn't matter. We've locked ourselves into a business as usual where we tell ourselves that tomorrow is an iteration of today and we can predict where we're going. And if we can't, we've got something wrong. And stepping out of that is quite important. Being comfortable with not knowing in an ever-changing world, but with feeling that we have the connections to ourselves, each other, in the more than human world, in order that we can ask for help, in order that we can then express whatever is ours to do in the moment. And from that, We know from every bit of human psychology that is being done at the moment that a sense of being, belonging, and meaning and agency are what give humans, people, us, that sense of a life well lived. Nobody wakes up in the morning wanting to go to a job that is pointless and where they are demeaned by people who claim authority over them. Nobody. So how do we transform into a world where that's not the case, where we go out into the world and do whatever is ours to do that leaves us feeling a sense of pride in our being the best of ourselves? And how does that look in a different world? It looks much more local, as Rupert said. We're reducing massively our power use because all of this move from fossil fuels to alternative forms of energy is just as, it's not going to slow consumption. We need to move away from the dopamine hits of continual consumption towards a much more serotonin mesh of connectivity with ourselves, each other, in the more than human world, so that we have that sense of being and belonging instead of trying to fill the endless void inside with consuming stuff. So how do we step away from a consumer cycle into a generative cycle? We grow our food much more locally. We create what power we need much more locally. We use much less power, but we use what we've got wisely. We're not stepping back into the Middle Ages. We're stepping forward into a digital world, a connected world, where we can still find worth in being human. Does that begin to answer the question, do you feel?
Yes, I think it does. And I mean, one of the examples that I really like is the Setsuden movement in Japan in 2011 to 12, where the whole nation, because of Fukushima and the tsunami, had to reduce their consumption. They couldn't provide the electricity because the infrastructure was so damaged. And through education and political will and engagement and agency, they cut the national consumption of the whole country by 20% in 1 year. So, it's perfectly possible. And I think that's the most useful aspect to this is a very difficult thing. The nature of emergence is that we don't know what's going to happen. And so therefore, how do we learn to ask questions when even the outlying shapes of the answers are so elusive? And that's what fascinates me, is how do we, so you have, a defined process called transformative adaptation, which has all the opportunity to think beyond silos, to combine different practices, disciplines, academic studies, and lifestyles, and combine them so that you're combining what could be deemed as negative adaptation with positive adaptation. But you're still on this real fertile edge of not knowing. And so I think all we can do is take really positive examples of what has happened when things have changed dramatically, and then postulate what might happen, or have this utopian perspective of not knowing.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, Maddy, and fits very closely, I think, what we're trying to do here with the book. So let me give a couple of examples, and examples really is the name of the game. So we can't know what it's going to be like. We have to, as you say, exist in not knowing, in unknowing, in what Keats called negative capability, and the kind of attitude towards life and the world that an increasing number of people are coming to understand through the work of Ian McGilchrist. We can, however, draw upon extant examples which point the way or point towards potential paths through. So it's quite striking, for example, that this book is based primarily in experience from the global north, primarily from Britain. And it draws, among other things, for instance, crucially on the experience of the Transformative Adaptation Collective, the TRAD Collective, which is a small group of people who are trying to model and live some of this, and who, among other things, gather each year at the Green Gathering. But at the same time, this is a book which is very definitely acknowledging the ways in which there have been examples and instances of leadership coming from the global south in this area. And why is that? Well, it's not very surprising as to why it is. It is because climate adaptation is, or has at least so far been, more essential in the global south than in the global north on the climate front lines, right? People in Nepal, people in Rojava in Syria, for instance, these are among the instances that are highlighted in some of the chapters in the book, have been showing the way in how to cope with climate extremes in a way which is adaptive and transformational, and deliberately so. And the idea of transformative adaptation, part of the idea is that what transformative adaptation is will itself have to shift over the coming generations. And those who have already, if you will, been on this journey, including folks such as those I mentioned in those countries, we need to learn from their example, because we are going to face many of these same perils in this country in coming years. We might face them in different forms. One of the ways in which we have to be living in unknowing is we don't even know, for example, whether we're actually going to have a future which is a future of continuing global possible, ironically, that the melting of the Arctic may throw countries like this one into a new cold age, into even a semi-Siberian climate. So we have to be ready to adapt to that kind of thing. How the hell do you do that? Well, you do it, for example, by having no regrets policies which are fit for very different possible futures. So people have got used to the idea, for example, of planting more Mediterranean style trees on their land or in their gardens. But actually, we need to be planting some Scandinavian trees as well. We need to be readying ourselves for potentially colder futures and potentially hotter futures, and almost certainly for a more chaotic future. This is enormously challenging, but what I've started to give there are some instances of how it can be done, and crucially, how we can start to learn from those who've been good at this already, who've been having to roll with these very difficult punches already.
And a lot of, I'll take beekeeping as an example. So I moved to Devon and took my Hampshire native bees to Devon in my camper van. That was an interesting journey. And they died within the first winter because it was so wet. And they had no adaptation to fly in the damp climate here. So since then I've been welcoming swarms into boxes from the woods, and they're completely different bees. They're slightly different colour. They fly in the rain, in light rain. They forage for as long as they can into the winter. Their characteristics, they're smaller, they seem to groom more so that they don't have such a high varroa count. They're just a whole different form of bee. They're perhaps not as conventionally productive as the bees, which are very much a mixed strains and genes in Hampshire. But they work better here in the very damp West. And I think, there's a lot of, Manda, you know far more about this than myself, but looking at older, more ancient species of animals, which are far more adapted to the land when it's disruptive and when the climate is unstable.
I'm not sure I do, actually. I didn't know that about bees. I think for me, this is a place where I would step into a slightly different frame, possibly than the book, which is, we have no idea. Our brains are very good at linear thinking, complicated thinking. Our brains are very, very, very bad at complex thinking. And part of the reason we're in the chaos that we're in is that we tried to take the complex and make it complicated. We tried to take things that are beyond our knowing and make them knowable. And we have no idea what's coming, other than it's not going to be what's been. So my go-to always is that we learn to ask the web of life, which is itself a hyper-complex system. And if there is any knowing, we'll find it there. and check in with that. What is mine to do, rather than trying to figure it out, which will break our heads. We're not going to be able to work it out. Exactly as Rupert said, we could be looking at 3 degrees global warming, and still, if the AMAC shuts down, minus 40 degrees in the winter in the UK. And frankly, I just don't think the UK will survive that. Our infrastructure isn't there. So we have no idea what's coming and how best to survive it. We have some basic parameters. We need to move local. We need to massively reduce our power consumption. And Japan, if they can do 20% in a year, then everybody can do 20% in a year. And I remember listening to Simon Michaud and Nate Higgins saying, at the moment, our global power consumption is 19 terawatts rolling. So any given time around the world, we're consuming 19 terawatts. And the smart money says that if we're going to not use up all of our resources and destroy all the ecosystems, we need to cut that to 5. So that's a 75% reduction in power consumption. What does that look like? What does it feel like? How do we get there? It's not sticking solar panels on the roof. There's nothing wrong with sticking solar panels on the roof. There are probably some good reasons to do it, but it's not going to be all the answer. And I think that's something that this book gets across really well, is we're given quick fixes, that the promise is, from the general consensus, that business as usual will continue if we all put solar panels and insulate our houses and get some batteries and recycle our plastics. And that was never going to cut it, and it certainly isn't going to cut it now.
Yeah.
So I would, all of these things are useful things to do, and they're not nearly enough. And for people's priorities to change, I think this is something this book can do, is we are in crisis now. Planning the 2.5 kids and the golden retriever and the mortgage is not where we're at anymore. What is ours to do that helps everybody to move through? And only each individual can answer that. Rupert, you looked like you had something to say there.
Well, I was partly just taken by the beautiful image of a cat moving through your hands and across the screen as you spoke about how we're going to move through the crisis that is coming. It was almost perfectly designed. What I was going to add was simply that one way to think about transformative adaptation, or TRAD for short, is that, as Manda has just said, it's about how in a positive way, right, not in a doomy way, how in a positive way we think about what I've described as the fact that this civilization is coming to an end. This civilization is finished. This civilization has a sell-by date. If we are to avert collapse, if we are to get through this small and rapidly closing window, there has to be a really profound transformation, not just the so-called green transition. It's partly going to involve, as we've implied already, becoming more place-based, becoming more relocalized. And that is, among other things, in any case, a crucial aspect of the adaptation challenge. Because if you think about decarbonization and so-called mitigation, actually quite a lot of that can be done by large-scale interventions, economic policies and technologies and so on being applied on a global level to a global more than problem, a global emergency. The amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is partly by definition a matter of something global. But adaptation is through and through something local. It has to be far more responsive to your local circumstances. It looks profoundly different in, say, upland Scandinavia from the Sahara, but it looks profoundly different in, say, temperate rainforests in Spain from drylands in Spain, right? It looks profoundly different in terms of if you're thinking of a potential massive drop-off of temperatures than if you're thinking of a massive increase of temperatures, albeit that it also looks very different if you have to be thinking about both of those as possibilities, from how it looks if you're looking, as most of the world is looking, at one of those being far more probable than the other, i.e. Overheating. So this is all by way of saying the adaptation challenge is by definition one which is place-based and local, and transformative adaptation takes that thought and really runs with it. And that, again, I think is going to be how it's fitted to our times and how it's going to be attractive to people, because people actually are hungry for a revival of community. They want to feel more of a tie to their land. They want to feel this sense of belonging and purpose that Manda mentioned a little while ago in our conversation. All of these things are things that what we're trying to talk about in this book actually deliberately buy into and create the conditions of possibility for.
And when we wake up in the morning and we feel energized and we feel agency, often we feel that because the people we surround ourselves with support that process. And it's this isolation and alienation that the way we live at the moment, which disempowers so deeply. So a change in values and how we live and in community. And I mean that in a very small c and loose way, but more back to that kind of connection will only support our courage to step forward into the unknown. And I think it's a vital ingredient. You can't do it on your own.
No, absolutely. And this has very much been our experience in the Trad collective, this hunger for community that we've found in ourselves, and we've formed a little prototype of community in response. And it's partly how we find also the resonance with the ideas that are portrayed in this book. And it's important to be clear that while myself and Morgan Phillips are the editors of this book, and Manda has made a huge contribution to the book as well, the book is a book which has several other people in it, and whose hinterland, if you will, goes far wider, right into and beyond this trad community, and including off into other countries. You know, this is a book which springs from that kind of experience which Manda mentioned of interbecoming. It's a book that couldn't possibly have been written by one person or even two or three people, really.
Yeah. So talk to me about COP, because some years ago, my heart always had some element of hope that there might be change. You know, before the days of 1.5 degrees increase and 400 parts per million and all those things that used to be familiar lines that we couldn't cross. And we've crossed them all relentlessly. And I think a lot of people who were deeply concerned 15, 20 years ago have kind of got to the stage where they don't go to COP. They don't even really engage with it anymore. That it's like a hopeless cause where nothing's going to happen, and it's not going to change anything. So how can we, though, collectively step into and sense some kind of agency, and who's doing stuff, and who is part of this larger community and change of values that people need to connect with and find their allies and not feel so isolated? Because I think that's the fundamental thing in building movements.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll make a start on that. So here we are. It's the last day of yet another COP. I mean, the fact that we're up to COP 29 itself really tells you quite a lot about the inefficacy of the process. And here we are releasing this book on that day. And why did we think this would be such a great day on which to release the book? Because as COP yet again comes to an end, and yet again disappoints, frankly, it's a good day to be thinking, okay, so yeah, what is the alternative? And yeah, let's be bold here. We think that transformative adaptation is a good way to understand what the alternative is. There isn't, by the way, nearly enough emphasis even now on adaptation in the COP process itself. The overwhelming emphasis is still on decarbonisation. They haven't come to terms with where we're at in terms of climate impacts, and that's probably because they don't want to. They don't want to admit how bad the situation is, how desperate the situation is, how deep the need is for a transformation that goes beyond the half-assed, frankly, idea of the so-called green transition. The idea, as Manda said earlier, you can simply carry on doing what we're doing, but have it on a more renewable, gradually more renewable basis. So yeah, what we're saying is this idea, transformative adaptation, is the closest we have probably to a viable alternative to COP. And this idea gets embodied through things like the trad collective, and it gets embodied through the precedents that there are for trad across the world, especially in the global south. And it can and should get embodied much more widely. There are efforts springing up, for instance, all over the UK, mostly under the radar still, in communities which are undertaking food growing or community energy and so on and so forth, in ways that are stepping into the adaptation and resilience space. Those efforts need to be stepped up a lot more. They need to be networked a lot better. They need to be understood and spoken about a lot more, and hopefully our book will contribute to that. The organization that I'm now the co-director of, the Climate Majority Project, you could think of transformative adaptation as a vital dimension of that enlivening of the climate majority. The climate majority, people who are realizing how much trouble we're in and want to do something about it. The way it's easiest for your average citizen to step into this space of doing something meaningful about the climate crisis is to get involved in transformative adaptation, or what we now call strategic adaptation. It is to get involved often, but not necessarily, at a really quite hyper-local level, at doing the kinds of things we've gestured at in this call. And in terms of the point about hope, there is so little genuine hope now that can be accreted to the COP process. And many people are suffering, and it's understandable, from a kind of hopelessness in relation to where we're at. Well, one might say that transformative adaptation is a hope of the hopeless, in the terms of that great hymn, Abide With Me. But that hope of the hopeless has to be what Joanna Macy, the teacher to many of us, calls an active hope. And of course, that's exactly what we're trying to report on and to foment in this book, the active hope that, if you will, is transformative adaptation.
Manda.
Can I,
Yes, please.
yeah, I think this is really important. Raymond Williams has a lovely quote, which is, "To be genuinely radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." And I think we're at an edge where the system is not broken. The system is designed to perpetuate the system within which we all live. And it does that really, really well. But the system is not fit for purpose. And increasing numbers of people are seeing that it's not fit for purpose, but they have no idea where to go yet. And I think this is why COP is never going to succeed, because the people that we elect at the top of our system are there in order to maintain the system. And therefore, I think that can't succeed, because the only way now, because this is not just a carbon issue. You could take all the carbon out of the sky somehow magically and stop emitting more, and there would still be polyfluorinated alkylated substances, otherwise known as forever chemicals, in the rain. There would still be microplastics in everything that we eat, such that if you rendered your brain down, there's enough to make a credit card in everybody's brain now. It's in human breast milk, it's in placentas. We have no idea what this is going to do. The things killing the oceans are yes, acidification, but they're also industrial agricultural runoff and microplastics destroying the phytoplankton, which produce half of our oxygen. These things, if the people at the top really got to grips with that, they would have to change the narrative, and that would probably not see them elected. So I would say, this is back to Amitav Ghosh, who wrote a fantastic bit in The Great Derangement, where he said, future generations looking back, will look at the Great Derangement and they will blame politicians and bureaucrats for their failure to act, as they should. But more, they will blame creatives, and particularly writers, for not creating other alternatives, because it's not the job of politicians and bureaucrats to imagine different futures. That's our job, us, all of us. And I think this is where this book has great value, is the beginning of imagining different futures, even the stating that different futures need to arise, because it feels so much at the moment. It's like when someone in our family gets old and ill and we want them to be like they were, or even the dog. I'm going to wait until we can go up the hill again at the speed we could, and gradually reach, okay, I'm going to wait till we can go to the end of the lane like we used to be able to. Okay, I'm going to wait until you can walk out into the garden to pee like you used to. We're on dogs now, not grannies. But we're still trying to get back to what was. We're not wrapping our heads around what could be. And the system is now at the point where it's staggering out into the garden, if it's lucky. And we're still trying to make things as they were instead of what could a new system look like? And as with Rojava or Nepal or anywhere else, there's a huge number of people around the world doing astonishing things to create new ways of being. What we need to do is bring them all together, knit them all together, and look at what would a whole community, what would a whole civilization look like if we were to take on board different ways. We need new governance systems. Our existing governance system is not fit for purpose. What does that look like? Audrey Tang has a whole system and took the government of Taiwan from 20% approval ratings to 80% approval ratings in a couple of years. And they didn't completely dismantle the system, but they showed a lot of different ways things could be done. All around the world, there are people working all day, every day to create something different in their own region. And we have an interconnected world. We have hyperconnectivity in ways that humanity has never had before. So it's possible to find out what people are doing on the other side of the world in a slightly different culture, and then bring them back and adapt them to our own living situation and really make them work. But we have to help people let go of wanting the world to be like it was, because it's never going to happen. It's not possible. But there's a huge emotional investment in, it was fine when I was young, let's just make it like that. And it wasn't fine when we were young. But we're very good at looking back with rose-tinted glasses. And now we need to look forward with clear lenses and see what's possible. Rupert, you look like you were
about
taking
fear and
notes again.
courage, isn't it? This is all about fear and courage.
Sure.
That looking back is
Definitely.
a fear reaction. Looking forward is an act of courage, because you're looking
Thank you.
into
Yes.
the unknown. So
Yeah,
we're
totally.
going to wrap up now, but do you have anything that you would like to finish with? Rupert,
Rupert, you looked like you did.
Yes.
Well, just to add a little note to, it's always good when there's a slight disagreement as well as lots of agreement on the fear and courage. I agree it's about fear and courage. I think perhaps more than you two do, that the fear is necessary too. We need to have the fear of what will occur if we don't go down the transformative adaptation type route. And these so-called negative emotions, the difficult emotions, they arise for a purpose. And their ultimate purpose is to show us the different facets, the different faces of love and care, and to be impetus to us to transform into the kind of courage that we need in order to do what we need to do, which, as Manda says, is something that we all need to be part of the imagining of. Although, as she also says, artists and writers and so forth have a kind of special responsibility here, which so far arguably they haven't fully risen to. And that's one reason why in the book we talk about the Thrutopian work that is emerging, and it's really important and exciting that it is emerging in the creative arts and to some extent in the mass media. And it's also, of course, why in the first place it made total sense to have Manda be part of this book as a practicing creative writer who's trying to get going on the challenging process of imagining paths through the chaos and difficulty that is coming. So yeah, I would emphasize strongly that that fear and grief and anger and shame all have their place. The point is not to get stuck in them, but to allow them to transform and to manifest as the energy and the determination and the love and the courage that they really are. And I hope that that transformative process too can be seen, or to some extent midwifed in the pages of this book.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have very little to add. I fear can become a freeze response, and we need that not to be the case. And that's exactly what Rupert was saying. We need to do the inner work so that whatever flows through us and is, provided we can see where we're going. I think that's the value of this book, is the opening of doors, that concept of Thrutopia, which is there are other ways of doing things, and look, here, let us show you some of them, because otherwise fear without agency almost inevitably leads to freeze. So the fear can act as an impetus, provided we have avenues of change that we can see and we can believe are possible, and that we have ideas of how to get there. And that exactly is what Throughtopian writing is for. Anyone listening to this who does any writing, please stop writing business as usual and start writing ways forward. You can do it in whatever genre you like, but start thinking of what happens when the system is not the system anymore.
How annoying. It seems like we've agreed after all.
Sorry. I'm sure we could find other things to disagree on.
On that happy note of agreement between the two of you, thank you so much for coming today. And
thank you. Thank you for
this
the
conversation.
opportunity.
Thank you.
Maddy, thanks for publishing the book.
Yes,
well done,
really.
Permanent Press. We're delighted to be with you on this journey.
And that too is an act of courage. So thank you. We really would like to celebrate that.
Thank you.